Research highlights that 70% of digital transformations fail. In this podcast, we explore the core reasons behind this failure and how to avoid the failure and get into the 30% that succeed. Welcome to Impact with Digital. I'm Jay Tikam, your host, CEO of Vedanvi, which is a sponsor to the show. In this episode, we get to the bottom of the 70% failure rate by using a case study and then unraveling why this happened. So let's get started. Every business, no matter how big or small, is compelled these days to follow some kind of digital strategy. If you're a small micro business, potentially you're embarking on digital marketing right now. If you're a large multinational, you're finding ways to use AI to analyze the data to unlock new revenue opportunities or to cross-sell products to customers. But really, there's no choice for any type of business except to follow some kind of a digital transformation strategy. So if you understand the benefits, you're more likely to pursue digital transformation. First and the most basic is it provides operational efficiency, allows you to reduce costs and streamline operations so that things work a lot smoother. The next layer is it allows you to become more competitive. Using digital strategies, you can create a much more enhanced customer service, which then woos customers away from your competitors and improves your market share. An exciting area really, and the most exciting area for digital transformation, is it helps you open up new markets, potentially markets that didn't exist or products that didn't exist. A good example would be fintech, where prior to fintech coming on the market, there was no such thing as crowdfunding or peer-to-peer lending. And fintech really brought that about through a combination of technology and business model innovation. And lastly, digital transformation can actually have a wider impact, not just on your organization, but also on society and the environment. Again, taking financial services into account, fintech has managed to drive financial inclusion in many developing markets. So really, just to start out with, let's look at the staggering numbers and the implication of the 70% failure rate. Statista, research organization, predicts that in 2025, organizations around the world will spend up to $3 trillion in digital transformation. That's a staggering amount of money spent on this pursuit of digital strategies. McKinsey highlights that 70% of digital transformations fail. And if you project that, basically it means that there's a 2.1 trillion worth of wasted costs. Now, obviously, if you're spending money on digital transformation, you're not going to get 100% failure rate, right? So you'll still get some benefit out of it. Assume that only 30% is wasted and 70% you get benefits. In that case, you're still wasting 900 billion annually across the globe, which is still a huge drain on resources. So it's important to understand why this is the case. If you understand the why, then it's easier to fix it and to see how we can basically reduce that 70% rate or get you into a position where you are in the 30%. So the odds are really stacked against digital transformation for some reason or another. And let's uncover why that's the case. We'll use a simple case study. Might be a little bit exaggerated, but it's really there to demonstrate real-world case study. So we take a mid-sized bank under pressure to modernize. It typically has an older client base. Clients seem to be a little bit disgruntled. They're starting to see some clients leave. The CEO one day goes to a conference and is captivated by an AI-based chatbot. And he thinks this is the future. It's going to allow customers to help themselves, get advice, and it allows them to cut costs and free up staff to work on more impactful strategies. So in his enthusiasm, he comes back to the board, convinces the board that something needs to be done. The board, not really fully understanding the whole process, decides to go ahead. Now, underlying all of this eagerness is a fear of missing out because this organization is fearful that competitors will get the leading edge in this digital world. So they have to do something. Anything, but they have to do something. And this AI seems like the best solution. So the board decides to appoint the COO as the lead project manager to implement this digital transformation initiative. The COO, not knowing where to start, turns to his consultant friend and asks him to come and make a presentation to the board. The consultant is heavily involved in the industry and has worked with competitors before. So he manages to convince the board that if nothing happens, potentially down the line, in a year or two, the company will see a huge loss in market share. And he demonstrates some of the examples of what competitors are doing. Convinced, and again driven by the fear of missing out, the board approves a significant budget to implement this AI solution. They decide that they don't have time to waste, so they're going to roll out the strategy right across the board in one go. Project is launched and things go into action. Departments are given the task to find ways to adopt this AI-based chatbot solution. We're not going to go into the implementation aspects, but looking further down the line, let's understand what transpires, because certainly things didn't go as expected. So the customer base is generally older in this case. They prefer more human connections. They struggle to understand complex technologies, and they just want to pick up the phone to a customer service agent. So the strategy is rolled out, and obviously things don't go according to plan. So we're not going to go on the challenges of implementing digital transformation. We'll cover that in the next few episodes. But let's look at the end result of it. The end result, customers are older, don't like to use new technology, being forced to use this technology. Didn't really go down very well, but nevertheless, customers tried. I think you got a lot of inquiries from customers who didn't know what was happening, didn't know how to use a solution. And the end result is, let's take a worst case scenario of something going wrong. The worst case scenario, an old lady used the chatbot to try and ask it for a financial product. She wanted to deposit some money. The chatbot gave her an interest rate and pointed her to a product. She invested her money. Turns out that the interest rate was wrong and she got a much lesser amount than the chatbot had promised her. She was obviously very frustrated and she made a huge complaint to the company and the organization. On investigation, the company had to recompense the old lady for all the lost interest. And worst case scenario, the complaint rates went up significantly. The high number of complaints all of a sudden caught the attention of the regulator, leading to a regulatory investigation. So what turned out to be a very small amount lost by this old lady now catapulted into a full-blown regulatory investigation. As a result of this launch, there were a lot of account closures. And as a result of this AI chatbot solution, which the board was so enthusiastic about, the end result is a disgruntled customer, and many such cases arising. We see a high number of complaints all of a sudden, and this led to a significant investigation by the regulators, which consumed the time of management. And the end result was that they got a fine and they got reprimanded by the regulator. From a customer's perspective, customers were so frustrated because the older generation just couldn't cope with this new technology. And given all the errors that were arising, this led to customer defection. So instead of getting customers, they actually lost customers. And over and above that, they also had to recompense customers for losses. And what went on inside is employees knew that this company was going down the wrong path. And they tried to warn management, but management basically just ignored them. Because at the end of the day, the COO was given the task by the board to forge ahead with the implementation. So it was really a case of brute will and just continue. They knew that there were going to be some snags along the way, given that this was a board priority. The COO just kept on pushing. So I think this is the worst case scenario showing that if digital transformation is not implemented correctly, it can not only just waste costs, but it can have a huge detrimental effect on the whole organization. Now, fortunately, in this case, things turned out okay because the board realized that this was an issue. They took heed, formed a committee, and in the end, the cost of this for the board was quite significant because quite a few of the executives lost their job. The new board restarted digital transformation, but in this case now they focus on key stakeholders and their needs. They understood their customers, they understood what the customers needed, and then they proceeded to develop a solution that fitted the exact needs of the customers. They did extensive research, they did competitor analysis, they engaged with fintech companies to understand how fintechs were engaging with customers and facilitating onboarding. They also interviewed and had extensive discussions and customer journey mapping for the older customers. They had focus groups, they had interviews. So they really collected a lot of data to understand the needs of the customers. And based on those needs, they prioritize those that would potentially bring them the biggest impact with the least amount of effort. In this case now, staff were engaged and building a digital culture was given a huge priority. Frontline staff and management were involved in all process of the solution design. The new initiative launched with extensive stakeholder engagement. And instead of rolling this out across the board, they now decided to pilot this in one part of the business just to test things out, learn, and iterate. So what can we learn from this case study? This is really a case study of missed opportunities. The CEO focused on AI chatbot, driven by the hype, not customer needs. The boardroom approved without understanding AI's complexities or customer preferences. The consultant prioritized profit potentially, selling a generic solution, not a tailored one. They tried to replicate what was happening at competitors rather than focusing the solution on specific needs of this organization. The department pursued AI for the sake of AI, ignoring core business problems and customer needs. So in the case of the chatbot, struggled with complex inquiries because obviously it's an AI solution and AI is as good as the data that you feed into it. Given that this was rolled out in a rush, not all eventualities were programmed. So when customers asked a complex problem or a complex question, the chatbot couldn't really answer appropriately. The older customer base preferred human interaction and they felt a little bit alienated. The lack of research basically led them to jump to this AI solution. In reality, after engaging with customers and understanding their needs, a video chat solution may have been a more suitable solution, which was completely overlooked. And in fact, some of the customers gave this suggestion, and this was strong bias towards a video chat solution where somebody else actually sitting on the other side of the telephone or a video call compared to talking to a machine. So the impact really was a customer churn, increased complaints, huge transaction errors, recompensation by the company losing money for operational losses, regulatory scrutiny. And given the pressure that staff are facing, staff felt demoralized and started to leave. Internally, employees recognized the flaws, but their concerns were ignored. The COO under pressure pushed forward despite internal warnings. So the cost of inaction really was quite significant. Massive customer loss and erosion of trust, significant regulatory fines, decline in market share, and costly AI program abandoned to then restart from ground zero. So yes, a little bit of an exaggerated case study, but it's just trying to give you a real world context of what can happen when digital transformation goes wrong. So while we talk about the 70% failure rate and the huge cost, remember that the cost is actually even wider because you could lose market share, you could lose profit, and you could lose your reputation, potentially making the level of damage or wasted costs even higher. So how to avoid the 70% trap? Let's look at some of the key aspects that we need to incorporate in digital transformation to make sure that we get a successful outcome. And be in the 30% who succeed rather than in the 70% that fails. So the first thing, as we've highlighted, is to identify compelling problems. Rather than having solutions like AI chasing a problem, we should start with a problem and then chase the solution. So if you're embarking on digital transformation now as a board, there are so many things you can do. And the question you would be asking is, where do we start? So if you don't know where to start, you will start where the market pushes you. You will be pushed by consultants. You will be pushed by vendors. You will be pushed by what your competitors are doing rather than adopting a solution that works for you. Now, even if you know where you want to apply digital transformation in what areas, how do you prioritize? You have to prioritize based on the impact that's going to generate versus the effort required. So you need to have some kind of a methodology to prioritize these efforts. So in this case, maybe the starting point may not have been rolling this out to customers, but maybe it would be a case of internally, let's work with staff to gather insights and get the data that can populate an AI model first. So the starting point may have been more appropriate at the staff level rather than the customer level. And therefore, we want to highlight the importance of stakeholders in the decision around digital transformation. We'll cover stakeholders in more detail in a later chapter, but this is just something I wanted to emphasize at this stage. Now, also from a compelling needs point of view, you should engage with not only staff, but department heads, and we should get them to talk to each other. So we should be breaking down silos and making sure that we have data from disparate sources and we have integrated systems that can talk to each other. So that in this case with AI, we could have a 360-degree view of the customer. So technology first really disregards stakeholder needs or align digital transformation to business strategy. It creates a solution that goes out looking for a problem. And as we know, there's never going to be 100% fit. Sometimes you might get away with it and you might get some benefit. But at the end of the day, trying to fit a business into a technology is never going to work. Secondly, You have to do research. You have to identify needs through extensive research. And this is really the crux of digital transformation, is to identify the problem. And you do that through the identification of needs, and not just needs of one type of stakeholders, but you have to identify needs of different types of stakeholders. So we categorize stakeholders into three categories. One is, who do we serve? So these are customers, potentially say shareholders. Then we ask, who are the enablers of servicing our customers or shareholders? And these typically are staff and management, potentially also partners. And then we're going to look at who are the influencers in making the decision on how we serve our customers. So these would be your board, your executive team, and also regulators. So if you look at it from that perspective, you get a very three-dimensional approach of the ecosystem that you need to look at. So at the end of the day, if you would deliver something to the customer, you also have to look at the digital solutions that apply to staff, for example, who are going to serve these customers. So these are the enablers. You might need to look at partnerships and how you can enable partnerships through digital transformation. You also need to look at the influencers like management and how you're going to report to them, for example. So market research could include lots of things. Surveys are a good starting point, followed by interviews, focus groups, discussions, but also looking at journey mapping and journey analysis. So somebody actually sitting in front of a customer and looking how they do things step by step to understand and map out the full journey, and doing that across different customers or different staff or different management. I think that's really quite key, and involving frontline employees who engage directly with customers is going to be a huge advantage because they have the insights that management would never have. Thirdly, once you've identified the needs, now it's really a case of prioritizing, because you can't do everything, all right? So there'll be a lot of needs that need to be addressed. So how do you assess the prioritization? Or how do you prioritize activities around digital transformation? One way of doing it is to look at what will the impact be if we implement this digital solution and how much effort is required. So the higher the impact, the lower the effort, the more priority this aspect or the digital transformation task is given. These are really the quick wins and the low-hanging fruits, which must be the priority because they bring the highest and the quickest results. When we looked at the AI chatbot, we realized that it may have been better to start off with staff first and collect the data, and then it would have been much easier to roll this out to customers potentially. In your research, you should also factor in some kind of innovation. So as we highlighted, whilst chatbots make sense and the market's pursuing it, your customers might prefer a video chat or some kind of SMS-based solution. And, given that they're an older generation, they may not have smartphones potentially. So I think you got to kind of think outside the box. And if you're addressing this issue, it's worthwhile looking at how can we improve. So innovation is a key part of that process. Now, we've spoken about the external aspects. Let's not ignore the internal aspects and the importance of buy-in and governance. When you're rolling out a solution, there's an ecosystem of stakeholders. So you need to ensure that all stakeholders are involved. You need to ensure that they have their input, they have their part to play, and therefore cross-functional teams really play quite an important role when you're rolling out some kind of digital transformation. Now bring them together, conduct an innovation workshop, come up with new ideas. If you're going to change something, let's take a step back and see how we can improve. It's no point just digitizing what you're doing currently. Take that step back, innovate, look outside your industry potentially to see how other type of organizations are implementing some solutions. Talk to fintech disruptors that are coming into the market. These companies start with a digital-first approach. They intimately understand the customer problems. They tech savvy and they're applying the latest cutting-edge solutions. Once you get a good idea, I think it's good to have, some kind of a governance framework which makes sure that progress continues, but at the same time, you've got to balance that with allowing your teams the flexibility to innovate. And in our example, we found that, staff were not listened to. So you have to create some kind of a channel to make sure that your staff can raise issues, concerns, and more importantly, ideas. And they have to be logged somewhere down the line and looked at objectively. This is a case where politics doesn't play a part. It's objectivity that matters. Fifthly, once you've prioritized and you've innovated, there's potentially a lot of solutions on the table right now. And you have to then assess the feasibility and assess whether the organization is ready to implement such solutions. So in our example, you had this AI chatbot. Clearly, even if the company had the means to implement the solution, the customers, in this case, were not ready. So while the staff may be ready, while the board may be eager, the customers were not ready. So you have to do a feasibility assessment and readiness. You have to evaluate the technology fit, whether that's the right fit, whether it's the appropriate fit. Then you have to look at the costs and the complexities of implementing it. You have to consider how they would integrate in the existing systems. So in our chatbot case, with lack of data behind the scene, really the chatbot's not going to be very helpful. You have to make sure that before you embark on this chatbot, you have to make sure that you find or develop mechanisms to collect the data, not just from one or two departments, but from across the organization in a holistic and standardized format so that you get a 360-degree view of the customer. And then lastly, as we said, rather than going all guns out, it's better to implement something on a pilot basis. So once you've established the feasibility, the sixth component that you need to look at really is measurement and course correction. So you launch an MVP, you test the solution, test it with customers, to have a handful of customers who are a little bit more proactive, get their feedback, get feedback from staff, get feedback from the market, see how this is impacting on your bottom line, and then look for opportunities to create that improvement. And this should kind of be a feedback loop that doesn't just happen once, but it should be a feedback loop that is in a continuous cycle. You should always be looking for ways to improve or for ways to avoid failure. And to do that, measurement is going to be key. So setting up KPIs, so key performance indicators, but also key risk indicators are really quite important as well. And tracking those systematically on a weekly, monthly, daily basis is going to be hugely important to then understand the trends of this data, which then guides basically an understanding of what you need to do to course correct. And I think for this, it's important to get staff feedback loop because staff really are in the front line and, you shouldn't ignore what comes out from them. So I think, once you've done the MVP, it's time to roll this out to the wider organization. You've learned your lessons. You've improved as far as possible. You've got feedback from customers. You've seen the impact. Now it's time to roll this out at scale and to do that in the most standardized format as possible so that you're leveraging the lessons learned and then built into that continuous feedback loops because digital transformation is not a destination, but it's a journey that you need to embark on. It's a journey of continuous improvement. So what are the key takeaways? And I'd say that really there's three key takeaways from this. Firstly, you need to listen. Understand your stakeholders. Understand the ecosystem they operate in. Understand their needs, their pain points, their aspirations. When I talk about stakeholders, I'm not just referring to customers, but I'm referring to the ecosystem, meaning staff, management, shareholders, regulators, partners, even suppliers. I think these are all important considerations because ultimately, to deliver something to the customer, you need all these three different types of stakeholders, as we highlighted before. So firstly, you need to listen. Next, you need to learn. So you need to get the data from surveys, from focus groups, from studies, from external data sources, from internal data sources. Now you analyze the data, identify best practices, explore innovative solutions, and adapt your strategy to the data. So first you listen, second you learn, and then you transform. So you implement with purpose. So you implement and execute your strategy effectively. You measure the results and iterate for continuous improvement. So the three key lessons learned really are first listen, learn, then transform based on understanding intimately the needs of your stakeholders. And remember, it's not always just customers that you're focusing on. You're focusing on an ecosystem of stakeholders. So if you were in COVID, for example, customers were important, but more important was to find digital solutions to allow employees to work remotely, right? So if you're in a situation where you're potentially going to list on the stock exchange, then your shareholders become the core priority that you need to focus digital strategies around, because information to management and executives is going to be the key driver. So that's what we're covering now. In future episodes, we will drill down a lot more into what we discussed. We will also discuss a lot more about how to adopt the stakeholder approach. And we will get guests to highlight real-world case studies and real-world learnings from their experience. This case study reminds us that digital transformation is a journey, not a destination. It's about continuous learning, adaptation, and a relentless focus on your stakeholders. At Impact with Digital, we believe your organization can achieve digital success. Our sponsor, Vedanvi, through their audit and rescue program for digital transformation, can help you get there. Visit www.vedanvi.com. It's www. Victor Echo Delta Alpha November Victor India.com to learn more and connect with Vedanvi. Remember, listen, learn, and transform. That's the key to unlocking your digital potential. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.